America, the richness of America, and the importance in America of elections that we can trust. We're here today to stand up for exactly that, for a vote that is accurate, secure, and fair and just, in which every vote counts and every vote is counted. This, in fact, is what makes America great: the promise of democracy and the promise of justice for all. We're celebrating today a judicial decision last night in Michigan by Judge Mark Goldsmith, who affirmed in his decision that this recount advances our fundamental right to vote and election fairness and accuracy, and that these things are the bedrock of our democracy. At the center of the recount in Michigan is this question of some 75,000 blank votes, so-called undervotes, a large increase over all undervotes in prior elections by about 70%, raising the possibility that communities of color have been disenfranchised by an erroneous counting of the vote. These blank votes center particularly in the counties in which Detroit exists. And these blank votes vastly exceed the margin of difference between the two leading candidates. So these votes are important, and it's important that a miscount or a dismissal of votes in the communities of color not be contributing to an erroneous outcome. We say this because it's known that this is commonly what happens, that the votes in the communities of color are not only discouraged before they even come to the polls by being wiped off the voter rolls by things like interstate cross-check or by voter ID laws that discourage communities of color from coming out to vote, but also in the voting booth itself and in the counting of the votes. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission, in fact, established that the odds of your vote being miscounted or discounted through either human error or machine error is increased massively by about 900% if you are voting in a community of color. So this is not simply an abstract concern. This is a very real concern, that these votes from this again being tossed into the dustpan here and disrespected. So we are standing firm for the hard-won and hard-fought right to vote, particularly for people of color in this country. We will not give in to intimidation, to legal maneuvering, and to bureaucratic obstruction. We celebrate, especially, all the local election officials and the volunteers, particularly in the states of Wisconsin and in Michigan, where the recount is now proceeding full speed ahead with a focus, with respect, actually, for a recount, a hand recount of the paper ballots. This is the gold standard, as the judge in Wisconsin affirmed with his decision last week, saying that, in fact, this is the gold standard and encouraging all of the local election bureaus and boards to recount with that paper ballot hand-counted standard. In Pennsylvania, unfortunately, the court system and the election system is politically entrenched and has been fighting this process at every step. For example, the Trump campaign has filed now to call for 27,000 affidavits in 9,000 voting precincts in order to verify the vote, in order to proceed with a recount in any precinct. This is an absolutely ridiculous and obscene form of bureaucratic obstruction. In addition, $1 million bond was going to be imposed on 100 voters who were calling for a statewide recount. Add to that the court date was being advanced to a time at which it would be impossible to provide the evidence that would be required in that court date. So, to make a long story short, it's clear that the fix was in against a verified vote in the state of Pennsylvania. So we are now moving to federal court to ask the court to please support and stand up for our constitutional right to vote, as expressed in the decision last night by the Michigan judge. That right to vote is embodied in this recount effort to ensure that we have a fair and accurate election that we can trust. So we are here to assure Donald Trump that there is nothing to be afraid of. If you believe in democracy, if you believe in the credibility of your victory, put down your arms, end your bureaucratic obstruction, end your intimidation, and join we the people of America who are calling for a democracy that serves all of us and elections that we can trust. So with that, we look forward to continuing to work with all of you in this grassroots movement to ensure that we can trust the results of this election and to make the improvements that we need so that we don't need to jump through all kinds of bureaucratic hoops in the future. We don't need to hold bake sales on steroids to try to raise millions and millions of dollars simply to ensure that our vote is accurate, secure, and fair. This is the constitutional rights of all of us that we are standing up for today. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm going to ask Jonathan to join me, and we will take your questions. Yeah, so Jonathan, if you switch. So Melissa, our press director, will be taking the questions. Yeah. Yes.
Donald Trump has called the recount effort as his scam to raise money. How do you react to that?
So once again, we urge Donald Trump to look at the facts, not to make up the facts. And in fact, if he takes a look at our website, you will see that every dollar raised is actually going into a segregated and dedicated recount account so that this money cannot be spent for any purpose other than advancing the recount. At this point, it doesn't look like there is any possibility that there is going to be money left over because the price keeps being raised on us. The price of our democracy, which is actually an outrageous concept that we have to dig deep and come up with millions of dollars to affirm our democracy. Nonetheless, it's very clear there are not going to be dollars left over. We will be lucky if we have enough dollars, and I encourage people to go to jill2016.com/recount to ensure that we can make this very critical exercise in affirming our democracy, that we can make that happen. Thank you.
The outcome, though. I'm getting mixed messages.
Yes.
Some people say this is not about the outcome. This is not about the outcome. But what I just heard from you is you think the outcome will be different in these three states.
Well, I think the outcome will be one of the important states to examine. There was no victor at the time, so I want to underscore that we were not challenging one candidate or assisting another candidate. This is about ensuring that all votes get counted.
Level of cyber attack and cyber intrusion. There have been cyber attacks on the voting systems in Arizona and Illinois. Voting files were seized. 20 other states were the victims of other attempts to intrude and hack this election. The Democratic National Headquarters was intruded. The email of John Podesta was intruded. We have assembled the world's leading experts in computer security and computer science, and they are unanimous. I'm answering your question if you'll let me finish. They have determined that it is indisputable that this machinery is vulnerable, that there is circumstantial evidence, and it is highly plausible that an intrusion has occurred. And the only way to check is to verify. And the verification process is something contemplated by our democracy. We are not engaged in a crazy, radical, undemocratic process. We are taking advantage of the mechanisms in every state that are supposed to allow us to explore when the most important election in this country could have been compromised. So anyone who's opposed to this, and the person who owns that building behind us, is involved in an anti-verification campaign, in a let's sweep it under the rug campaign, in a let's hide it. And we are not going to surrender to that, because the essence of a democracy is grounded in the vote, in the awareness that every vote counts. Votes matter. We have mechanisms to ensure it. We have checks and balances throughout this system. When people go to a tennis game, they spend $45 to make sure that when the ball is called in and it might be out, we should take a look at it to see if it's actually in or out. And guess what? Sometimes it's out. And so what I think many people think, the 150,000 people have decided that it's worth $45 to make sure that our democracy is functioning. I think the democracy is probably as important as a tennis match.
You want to recount each vote in those 3 states?
We want to recount all the paper ballots. The experts, the world-class experts that we have assembled are unanimous that the only way to verify this and make sure that our democracy is functioning and not dysfunctional is to count the ballots.
What is the Pennsylvania judge specifically asking for?
Mel, are you officiating? Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Oh.
They are requiring a series. It's a Byzantine, labyrinthine effort. Everybody, I think, has experienced in our lifetimes that bureaucracies in governments and municipalities can make our life very difficult, if not impossible, when we're trying to do the easiest thing. The history of poll tax in this country is a history of barriers and impediments designed to keep people from vindicating their rights. And what we have in Pennsylvania, unfortunately, what we've discovered is a system where all sorts of barriers have been imposed to keep people from exercising their right to insist on a discount. And that's why we're going into federal court in the same way we went into Michigan and Wisconsin, and hoping that the federal courts will seize their obligation and do what the federal courts have done in Wisconsin and Michigan, and make sure that we have the ability to do the simple thing of verifying the vote.
Jill, what have you been impression?
Would you be here today?
Yes. Absolutely. Throughout the election, I was often asked, because the Green Party has led recount campaigns before. Throughout the election, I was asked if there were questions about the vote and a recount was indicated, would I step up to the plate? And I always said, yes, I will do that, regardless of who the victor is, if there are questions about the process. These 3 states were identified because they have indicators that make them more, shall we say, red flags, due to the nature of the voting machines that are used, due to irregularities like this high number of blank ballots in Detroit, due to extremely thin margins. These are some of the indicators that people look for when they're raising the question, was there compromise in this election, or was there machine error? Those are the questions that are asked. It's not a question of who won. So we went into these states because they met those criteria, because their deadlines had not yet closed, and because they have laws that actually permit a recount, unlike Florida, which would have made it very difficult. Well, put it this way. There are a variety of indicators that suggest that people actually did vote. They reported they voted when they came out of the polls. The exit polls are rather consistent with the polls prior to the election. So the United States USAID, our Secretary of State Department, looks at these kind of indicators when we are passing judgment on the fairness and accuracy of elections in other countries. So using the indicators that we ourselves use on other elections, there's some questions raised here that ought to be answered. Thank you.
Joe, can you describe how, at the very least, this continues the process of seeing to it going forward that we end voter suppression and every vote is counted here?
Thank you. Thank you so much, because there's not a quick and simple fix here. This is not just one issue, we fix it, and everything is fine. We regard this question of election integrity, of counting the votes, making every vote count. This is a first step towards an election system that we can trust and which is just. So this is what we do right now, because this is very time sensitive. We can only do this now to basically get rid of these voting machines that are wide open, that are an invitation to human error, to machine error, to malfeasance, and to hacking. It's time to make the touchscreen voting machines a thing of the past, and to actually vote on a paper ballot where we have that enduring record, which you don't have from the touch screens. Even if they spit out a piece of paper, it's a very fallible and fragile piece of paper. We need to be voting on paper ballots and counting them on these scanners where we are using automatic audits. We are constantly cross-checking to be sure that the vote is valid coming out of these machines. But that's not all. We must ensure that all people have the right to vote, that we have a constitutional right to vote, and that people are not purged from the voter rolls by things like this interstate cross-check, which is believed to have purged millions of people across the United States from the voter rolls through a very false standard that looks at common last names and just automatically eliminates people when names are similar across states. So this is a very unjust way that denies our constitutional right to vote. We also call for informing and empowering voters so that we can actually make good decisions as voters. We need open debates. We need a debate commission which is not controlled by the two corporate political parties who have been very busy ensuring that no other voices are heard. We need not only to have a right to vote, we need to know who we can vote for, and we need to be able to vote without fear. So we also call for a voting reform that enables you to go into the vote and rank your choices so you don't have to vote your fears rather than your values. This is ranked choice voting. It was just passed by the state of Maine, and it means you can vote for your first choice knowing that if your first choice loses, your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. So there is no splitting of the vote. There's no spoiling of the vote. There's no need to vote for a lesser evil. We can actually vote for the greater good, which is what we urgently need in this country.
One last question over there.
Great. So the next step right now in the recount process, the next step right now is to ensure that in the same way Michigan and Wisconsin have launched their recount, recounting all the votes, doing a hand count of the paper ballots, we need to bring Pennsylvania up to that standard as well, which is difficult because Pennsylvania doesn't have any paper records for the most part. It's all in the machines. So it's or 80% is in the machines. It's very important that we be able to examine the machines, to do a forensic analysis of the machines, to make sure that this electronic voting has not been compromised. So that's number one, is to bring Pennsylvania up to speed and to complete the recount in the next week or so that we are done well in advance of this so-called Safe Harbor Day on December, what is it, the 15th? 13th. Well in advance of December 13th. And to move this forward in the way that the American people deserve. Well, that recount will be beginning this afternoon at noontime. And, you know, we shall see. We don't yet have results from from Wisconsin, but this is the whole reason to do it. To know whether this vote has been a good one or not, we actually have to examine the evidence. That's why we need to move forward with this hand count of the paper ballots. So stay tuned. It will be exciting. We'll keep you posted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.